There is a frequency that only opens after midnight. Most people spin right past it, a wall of static between the stations. But if you stop, if you hold there, sometimes a voice comes through. And some of those voices have been gone for a very long time. Welcome back to the midnight frequency. Turn the lights down. Put the world on hold. For the next few hours, it's just you, the dial, and the dark. What you're about to hear are the calls that came in on the nights nobody could explain, ordinary people, on empty highways and in quiet houses, all reaching for the same phone to say the same thing. I've never told anyone this before. Some of these stories are strange. Some are sad. And a few of them still don't have an ending. So settle in. Keep the lights where they are. The lines are open, and tonight, it seems, the dead still have something to say. Let's begin. The first hint of trouble came just after midnight, when the static on the radio began to fade into the night. Hello. Hello. I whispered, trying to keep my voice from cracking. A soft crackling echoed back, as if trying to acknowledge me, before settling into a dull roar. I lay awake in our tent, listening to the rhythmic whooshing of the tent flaps blowing in the breeze. Outside, the Olympic forest was alive with the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, an odd sound began to circulate around us, like a slow, purposeful circle that seemed to be stalking its prey. Does anyone hear this? I called, my voice barely audible over the hiss and pop of the radio. There was no answer from the other campers, everyone had gone quiet. The only response was an increasing sense of dread that clung to the air like a thick fog. The thing began its slow circle around our tent, drawing closer with each passing minute. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every breath a struggle as panic threatened to overwhelm me. Okay, stay calm, I whispered to myself, but even as I spoke, I knew it was useless. Suddenly, the temperature dropped several degrees, and the wind seemed to pick up velocity. The tent flaps whipped violently, almost as if they were being pulled by an unseen force from inside the forest itself. Outside our tent, a faint, indistinct growl rose and fell, mingling with the sounds of the trees creaking under their own weight. Does anyone hear that? I tried again, this time more urgently. Silence was my only companion as the thing continued its eerie, slow circling pattern around the campsite. I reached for the flashlight on the ground beside me, pressing it to my face and struggling to find any flicker of light. The beam failed to penetrate the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows that seemed almost alive, dancing in response to some unseen command. The growling escalated into a deep, guttural rumble that reverberated through the trees. It was then I noticed the faint blue glow appearing from the forest edge, a soft, otherworldly light that pulsated and swelled with each circle of the thing around our camp. Someone, say something, I pleaded, my voice hoarse and strained. The radio static grew louder, as if the equipment itself were protesting it being used in such a way. A faint whisper caught on the line, is it coming? The growling ceased completely for an unending moment, leaving only a deep, oppressive silence that pressed against me like a heavy weight. Then, just as dawn was breaking and hope began to creep back into my bones, the thing moved in a single, slow, silent circle around our tent, its blue glow pulsing brightly. A chilling realization washed over me, this wasn't ending, not by any means. And in that moment of dread, I knew with absolute certainty that we had only seen the beginning. The radio fell silent as dawn broke, leaving behind a single haunting sentence, and it circled us once more before fading into the trees. It was 2 a.m. in Ely, Minnesota, and Dale's old Ford Bronco was sputtering along an empty back road. The radio had long ago given up its static, leaving only the ghost of a distant rock station whispering through the speakers. He needed to get home, he was exhausted from his night shift at the sawmill. But as fate would have it, something, or someone, was about to interrupt Dale's silent journey. Dale swerved slightly, glancing over his shoulder. The taillights of the Bronco winked out one by one like dying stars. His truck rumbled down a dirt track, and suddenly, he found himself in an unfamiliar place. A thick fog had settled around him, giving the forest a strange, hazy sheen. This wasn't the usual trail he followed. Ahead, Dale saw it, a clearing with a small structure nestled between two pines. As his headlights caught it, he could make out a lean-to camp, not unlike the one where he kept his own gear and extra ammunition for the deer seasons to come. But this was different. This lean-to felt wrong. Dale slowed down, trying to shake off the feeling of an unseen presence. He parked the Bronco on a small hill overlooking the clearing and got out. The night air was cold, and a sharp wind blew through his shirt. He grabbed the flashlight from the back seat and switched it on. The beam cut through the fog like a knife. As he approached the camp, the lean-to seemed to shimmer slightly, as if disturbed by an unseen force. But what made Dale's skin crawl were the faint footprints leading away into the woods from the camp's entrance. Footprints in mud that hadn't been touched for days. They disappeared just past the Treeline. Dale hesitated, his breath coming out in visible puffs. He shook himself, willing the chill to dissipate. With a heavy sigh, he stepped closer and noticed something peculiar. The fire pit was still warm. Embers lay scattered around it, glowing dimly as if they were trying to communicate with him. It was too early for such a big bonfire. No one had been here in days. But then he saw it, a small bag lying by the fire, almost hidden among the ash. He reached out and picked it up. Inside, he found his own hunting knife, carefully wrapped in the soft leather belt he wore around his waist on every hunt. How did this end up here? Dale's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe a deer had wandered into the clearing and taken the knife, but that didn't explain why the camp looked like it was just vacated. And there were no animal tracks leading away from the camp at all. Suddenly, Dale heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper of whine through the trees. He spun around, his heart pounding, but he saw nothing. The clearing had gone completely still except for the faint movement of branches in the breeze. Something was watching him. Dale quickly stuffed the knife back into its bag and started walking away, feeling like an idiot for having stopped here at all. But as he turned to go, he noticed that one of the footprints by the lean-to seemed to move ever so slightly, as if a ghostly finger was pushing it forward. The chill from his earlier fear now seemed amplified. Before he could react, Dale's phone rang. It was just after 2:30 a.m., and in Ely, that was considered dangerously late for calls. He hesitated, wondering if he should answer or not. Finally, with a deep breath, he pressed the green button. "Hello?" he whispered into the night. A strained voice on the other end said, "Dale. It's me. Jim." The name made Dale's stomach drop. Jim was his cousin, who had been missing for over 2 weeks. The line crackled as if it were being eaten alive by static. "Jim," Dale replied cautiously, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can't hear you very well. Where are you?" There was a long pause, long enough that Dale thought he might have hung up the phone. Then, the voice came back in a whisper, barely audible. I'm at your camp." The line went dead. Dale stood rooted to the spot, the words echoing through his mind and the trees around him. Jim was here, somewhere in this haunted forest, but he wouldn't say where. The cold night air felt more like a physical presence now, wrapping itself around Dale as if it wanted to suffocate him. And then, just as Dale was about to hang up, he heard another whisper. "Don't go back, Dale. The night was thick with fog when I first stumbled upon the cabin. My name is Jack, and my wife Betty and I were just passing through Whitefish on our way to a vacation rental out west. We were deep in the woods near Crystal Lake, wandering without a map or compass, just following the trail until it narrowed into an old forest road that seemed to lead nowhere. It was getting late, and we had veered off course. The headlights of Betty's truck cut through the mist, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We were supposed to be in familiar territory, part of our usual route, but this felt like a dark, isolated no-man's land. Betty was dozing in the passenger seat when my eyes caught sight of it, a cabin, partially obscured by trees, sitting at the edge of a clearing. It looked out of place. The windows were dirty and dim, as if they had been closed for years. I couldn't make out any writing on the outside. My curiosity got the better of me, and I suggested we check it out. Betty yawned and reluctantly agreed. We approached slowly, the crunch of gravel under the tires the only sound. The cabin was old, perhaps from another era, with peeling paint and overgrown vines clinging to its sides. As we opened the door, a musty coldness seeped in. The interior was sparsely furnished, some rickety wooden tables, a broken couch, and a collection of dusty books that looked like they belonged on a shelf. There were no names or labels, no signs indicating ownership. It felt abandoned, yet it didn't look vacant. Betty shivered as I flicked on the light switch. A moment's delay before the bulb clicked on, revealing an eerie stillness. The walls were bare of any personal touches, save for a few faded photographs, some old men in uniform and women dressed in formal attire, their expressions lost behind glass frames. These were strangers from another time, their lives long since extinguished. I noticed the phone by the wall and reached for it hesitantly. It was cold to the touch, and as I turned it on, a staticky noise filled the air. My fingers fumbled with the buttons until they landed on a call-waiting signal. There were messages. Betty stepped closer, her breath visible in the chill of the cabin. "Hello. Hello," she whispered, as if trying to summon someone from beyond the phone itself. The lines buzzed and crackled intermittently, producing an unsettling static that seemed almost like whispers. We listened intently, but no voice emerged. The noise grew louder, more persistent, until it felt as though we could hear distant moans, faint, sorrowful wails floating through the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the phone tightly. Betty let out a small cry, and before either of us could react, the cabin began to shift. The walls seemed to bend inward, closing around us with unnatural force. We tried to scream, but our voices were swallowed by the thickening air. And then everything went black. In the stillness of a winter evening in Bend, Oregon, Sarah was driving home from her night shift at the local diner. The roads were quiet, the street lights casting long shadows over deserted streets. Her car hummed softly as she swerved to avoid hitting a stray cat. It yowled and scurried away into the darkness. Suddenly, her phone rang. It wasn't surprising. She had left the battery charging in the diner, and it was 2:30 a.m., when the world was asleep. She pulled over onto an empty side street, her heart pounding as she answered. On the other end of the line was a man with a deep voice that seemed to carry through the phone lines like a cold draft from a nearby open window. "Hello?" she asked hesitantly into the receiver. "Is this Sarah?" "I'm glad you picked up," he said, and there was something in his tone, something almost relieved. "This is Rick. Do you remember the ranger who worked night shifts at the Blue Mountain campground?" Sarah's mind immediately conjured an image of a middle-aged man in a park uniform, always too busy to offer directions or check on the cabins. But why did he ask specifically about this one? "Yes," she replied cautiously. "He stopped working last month, didn't he?" Rick's voice was softer now, almost whispering into the phone. Sarah nodded silently, unsure how much of his story she should share. Yeah, they got a new guy. I heard he used to be an arsonist. A long pause followed, during which Sarah could hear the faint sound of someone breathing heavily. Then Rick spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. There's more to the story than that. You see, he was also known as a quiet man who never talked much and kept to himself. Everyone said he had one rule: no night shifts on Halloween. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. How could she have missed this detail? So, why are you telling me this now? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Rick sighed into the phone. He broke that rule only once, and I think it was for you. His words were like the creak of an old door in a cold night. Me? Sarah's throat felt dry as she swallowed hard. What does that mean? There are things that can't be understood, Rick said softly, his voice now tinged with an almost desperate tone. Things that happened on that night shift, and it was never explained. Sarah leaned back in her seat, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Did something happen to him? She whispered. Yes, Rick's voice held a grave solemnity. But even now, standing where I am, looking at the very spot where everything went wrong, I can't remember the exact details. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had heard stories like this before, strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena, but to hear someone speak of it with such urgency. You're sure about that? You know something that happened? She pressed. Yes, Rick replied firmly. I saw him standing at the ranger station, and he looked different somehow. Not just his appearance, but his demeanor, his whole aura. He seemed as if he had encountered something beyond this world. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Did you say you saw him? Rick hesitated before responding. I did, he admitted quietly. But it was only for a moment. Before I could ask what happened, the lights went out, and when they came back on, he was gone, completely disappeared. Sarah's hand tightened around the steering wheel. What do you mean he disappeared? I don't know how else to explain it, Rick said, his voice breaking slightly. The ranger station seemed empty for a moment, like he had just vanished into thin air. A cold shiver ran through Sarah as she processed this. And after that night, did anything change? Did anyone find out what happened? Rick sighed heavily. Nothing was ever reported in the area. No missing person cases, no strange sightings afterward. It's like it never happened. Sarah felt a deep unease settle over her. But you know something more than this, she said softly. Yes, Rick replied with a sense of finality. It might be better if I didn't tell you, but you need to listen carefully. Because every Halloween night after that, the ranger station is empty, and no one can enter or leave it without a strange feeling in their gut. Sarah listened in silence as the line went dead. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Sarah stared at her phone for several moments, then turned back onto the road, her car headlights slicing through the darkness. The forest seemed to close in around her, each tree blocking out more of the moonlight. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. Don't touch that dial. Stay with me, the next one is worse. The static crackled in my ear, a distant hiss that clung to the night air like an old, uncomfortable silence. This is midnight frequency, said the calm host's voice, I'm listening. My name was Mark, and I used to work the night shift at the general store in Asheville, North Carolina. I called because of that damned trail. It started when I took a job as a guide at Hemlock State Park, just outside the city. I was no expert, but I did know my way around the woods well enough. The park had an old map in its archives, tucked away behind the dustbin near the main office. On it, a single trail stood out with a marker that said Old Growth. Curious, I plotted it myself one night, my headlamp cutting through the forest's gloom. The first time I tried to follow it was under the cover of darkness, after work. The trail led me deep into the woods, and for what felt like hours, I wandered with a flashlight in hand, my heart pounding against my ribs. It twisted and turned, but always ended up back at the same clearing. I shivered as the night grew colder. It was late, and I'd been gone too long. Just then, a figure appeared out of the mist. Tall, hooded, almost ethereal. Before I could react, it faded back into nothingness, leaving me alone in the silent woods with only my heavy breathing to break the silence. I tried once more that night, and again, the trail led me straight back to that clearing. The figure didn't appear again, but something about the place lingered, an unspoken weight in the air. That was when I realized it wasn't just a trail, it was a loop, one that always brought you back. The fourth time, I called my old friend Sarah for company. We hiked together on our shift-off night, and she agreed to check out this old-growth path with me. As we approached the clearing, Sarah's flashlight caught something on the ground. A small trail of blood had been laid down, leading directly into the forest. I stopped, my breath catching in my chest. "What is that?" I whispered, looking at her for reassurance, but she just shrugged and stepped forward into the trail. Hours later, we emerged from the woods with nothing to show for our effort except a deep sense of unease. The clearing was unchanged, but the trail doubled back on itself, crossing over in strange patterns as if mocking us for trying to break its hold. Now, Mark in Asheville, I hear it almost every night. The static cuts out and the host says, "You're listening to Midnight Frequency," but I can't shake that feeling of something watching me. That trail still waits, always doubling back, never ending, a whispering loop in the darkness that haunts my nightmares. Did you ever find your way home from the old growth? At 2:43 a.m., as I sat by my car radio, trying to pick up any static or signal through the night, a deep and familiar voice called out from the dark. "Randy? Randy, are you there?" My heart skipped a beat as the voice seemed to whisper directly into my ear, chilling me to the bone. I had just returned from a month-long road trip, stopping at a small campsite off Highway 92 between Beatrice and Columbus. It was early April, cold and damp, my old truck windows steamed up with my own breath. The radio had been on for hours, blaring the usual late-night chatter, but this call, it felt different. Randy was my father's name. The man who left us when I was 10. He used to tell me stories of the prairie ghosts that wandered these empty roads at night. In the dark and stillness of the small campsite in Beatrice County, those whispers seemed real. I squinted into the darkness. No one else was around. Just trees shrouded by a dense fog, leaves whispering secrets to each other as if they were keeping watch over me. The call had hung on for 2 seconds more before fading away, leaving only the static of abandoned airwaves. Maybe it was just an old campsite radio playing up, or maybe, well, maybe my mind was finally driving me crazy after weeks on the road. I chuckled softly to myself and turned the dial, but nothing but hiss greeted me now. I shook off the feeling, promising myself a night of peaceful sleep in that forgotten cabin. But that voice, the soothing yet sinister tone, lingered in the air long after the radio's last static crackled away. I couldn't shake the feeling it was watching, waiting for something. Hours passed. I tried to focus on the radio host's ramblings about haunted hitchhikers and abandoned gas stations from old road trips. But somewhere between tales of the spectral and a lullaby played in a creepy minor key, that voice started whispering again, "Randy." My phone buzzed, startling me. A text message from my sister. She wanted to know how I was doing, just like she did for the past week. Maybe this was her, trying to reach through the night, using Dad's name as a riddle. I opened my phone and sent her an emoji of a nodding head. But as I closed the phone cover with a click, that voice called out once more, "Randy." I pressed the button to call my sister back before it could ring, but by the time she answered, the voice had ceased its haunting. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her concern was real, like her worry for me always was. "Yeah, just cold," I lied, hugging my knees in the chair. "Everything's fine." We talked a bit about how things were going out there. She knew I'd been working those night shifts at the old flour mill, and she wondered if it had been too much on top of everything. But as we said our goodbyes, that voice called out again, "Randy." It was as if my sister's words triggered the ghostly whisper. I hung up quickly, but not before my name echoed in the small cabin. The silence that followed felt heavy and wrong, like something had just passed through. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, listening to nothing but the distant howling of wolves on my radio app or an endless loop of static where that voice used to be. In the quiet moments before dawn, a single question haunted me: who was calling out from the Treeline? The voice crackled through the staticky air like a distant siren. "This is Midnight Frequency," the host intoned in his calm, deep tone, "a place where every night tells its own tale." It was 10 p.m., and the world outside Dodge City, Kansas, lay shrouded under a blanket of dark clouds. Jack, an ordinary man who worked late shifts at the local meatpacking plant, had already shut down his truck engine but still hesitated to climb out. A low rumble seemed to come from deep within the earth, a distant growl that tickled the back of his neck. "Hello," he finally said into the radio microphone. His voice was steady, though his hands shook slightly as they gripped the edge of the dashboard. The host responded with a gentle, reassuring tone. "Jack, I can hear you clear as day on this end. What's your story?" Jack cleared his throat and began. "It wasn't my first time out here," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of excitement that seemed to clash with the foreboding atmosphere. "But tonight was different." Jack parked his truck in front of the small stand he called home during hunting season. His job left him exhausted, but he relished the solitude and quiet of the open fields. He set up his gear with practiced ease, adjusting the ladder and securing his flashlight before stepping out into the chilly air. The deer were usually around, but tonight was oddly silent. Jack checked his surroundings. The field stretched before him like an empty sea, under a sky thick with clouds. A sense of unease gnawed at his insides as he climbed the aluminum stand, lashing himself in place. Up high, the world looked different. The fields lay below in shadowy patches, and even the trees seemed to lean towards him in an ominous silence. As Jack settled into his seat, ready for the watch, a faint whisper of movement caught his attention, a flash of fur at the edge of his vision. It was the doe, moving cautiously across the field. She stood still for a moment, then her eyes locked onto something beyond Jack's line of sight. The deer took off, dashing away in one swift motion that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "Nothing out here but an ordinary evening," he said to the radio, forcing his voice to stay steady, "except." He paused, swallowing hard as another small wrongness crept into the air. A hush fell over the landscape, and the deer stood still, its head cocked in a direction Jack couldn't see. And then, without warning, a rustling sound began on the other side of the field. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing moment. Jack's hand fumbled for his flashlight, and as he panned the light around, he saw nothing unusual, a dark patch where a tree once stood. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. The rustling ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to weigh down on him. Suddenly, a distant growl rumbled through the air, deep and unhurried. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the field once more. Nothing moved, but the growl persisted. He felt like he was being watched from somewhere unseen. That was when the deer stood up straight, its head turned towards something across the field. It didn't run. Instead, it watched with a strange, unblinking gaze before leaping into the air and climbing onto the stand next to Jack's. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling as he reached out a hand toward the empty space where the deer had been moments ago. His fingers brushed against the cold wood of the ladder. No doe there now. Just an unsettling chill that seemed to seep into every part of him. The growl faded, and all was quiet once more. The only sound was the distant hum of a highway far too close for comfort. Jack sat on his stand, staring out at the field. A small wrongness had crept in, a sense of something not quite right, that gnawed at the edges of his rational mind. "Good night," he finally said, his voice barely audible over the static. "Until tomorrow, Jack." In the quiet of a Maine evening, as the sun's last rays melted into the horizon, Sarah felt an unshakable unease settle in her bones. The radio station's static hum was like a lullaby, but tonight it bore a warning note. At 2 a.m., Sarah had dialed the midnight frequency, hoping to dispel the growing sense of dread that clung to her like morning mist. The phone rang twice before the familiar voice cut through the airwaves. "Welcome to the midnight frequency," he began in his calm, unhurried tone. "It's 2:07 a.m., and I'm your host, Jack. Tonight we have a story from Bangor, Maine. Let's listen." Sarah's throat was dry as she cleared it. "Jack, can you hear me?" she whispered. "Yes, Sarah," he replied gently. "We can hear you loud and clear." "Okay," Sarah said, her voice trembling just slightly. She had picked this time because it seemed like a good divider between day and night, life and something beyond the veil. "I'll do my best." "I'm listening," Jack encouraged. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It started as a small thing, a whistling sound in her ear, so faint she almost missed it. But then another one joined, higher, more urgent. A chill snaked down her spine. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, but Jack had already heard. The static seemed to ripple with her words, amplifying the whispers. "Yes," he said softly. "Tell us what happened." She began to describe an evening in Bangor, Maine, when she was just 23 and working a night shift at the local paper mill. It was a simple enough place, wooden floors creaking underfoot, the smell of kerosene oil lingering despite years of no fires being lit. Sarah had been walking up the dimly lit stairway to the third-floor office, her flashlight beam dancing on the walls. The mill's hours were long and monotonous, leaving plenty of time for thoughts to wander. It was near midnight, and she was thinking about how she might finally move out of her parents' house when a faint whistling began. Sarah paused in her ascent, listening intently. There it was again, 3 distinct whistles, each one growing louder as if they were closing in on her from different directions. The whistles weren't sharp or piercing, they sounded almost melodic, as if a ghostly choir practiced by the walls. She followed them with her flashlight, hoping to find their source. But the mill was empty, save for an old, rusted coffee urn sitting in one corner and the faint hum of machinery from below. The whistles grew louder still, more urgent, until they sounded like footsteps approaching. Sarah's heart raced as she shone the light around. Then came a pause, just long enough to make her imagine the footsteps were turning away. But that wasn't it. The first whistle faded, replaced by 2 new ones. They echoed through the empty space, circling back and forth in an eerie dance, getting closer every time. It was then Sarah noticed a dim light flicker in one of the offices on the second floor. "Do you see that?" she whispered into the radio, panic starting to set in. The lights had never flickered like that during her shifts before. Jack's voice was calm but urgent. "Sarah, what is it?" "I think." "I can't tell," Sarah admitted. I just saw a light and now, nothing. But those whistles keep coming. The static grew louder as the radio struggled to pick up the signal. Sarah could almost feel her fear leaking through into Jack's voice. Jack hesitated for a moment. Sarah, stay calm. We'll get you out of there safely. Stay where? She asked, her voice trembling. I don't even know if I can make it down those stairs. I'm listening, he reassured her. Take your time and tell me everything. The whistles grew louder, more insistent. Sarah shone her flashlight around, but the light in the office flickered on and off again, like a faulty bulb. The first two whistles faded, leaving only the third one, a single, haunting note that seemed to be following her. Jack. I think it's leading me somewhere, she said, her voice strained. And every time it stops, another whistle starts up. A sharp burst of static interrupted her words. Jack's voice cut through it again. Sarah, did you get close enough to see where the last light came from? Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to move any closer if there was a trap. But the whistles were relentless, growing louder until they sounded like someone was at the top of the stairs. I don't know, she said breathlessly. It might be a signpost or something. The light kept moving up and down as if it wanted me to follow. Try to keep track of its movements, Jack urged her. Can you see anything else unusual? Sarah scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. She noticed an old photograph on one of the desks, a family with their arms around each other, smiling widely. It was a strange image, given how quiet and isolated that office seemed. The whistles began to fade again, replaced by a deep, rumbling noise, almost like a growl or a snarl. Sarah's flashlight beam hit a shadowy corner just as the lights flickered out entirely. Jack, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the escalating static. Yes. Sarah hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. It sounded like something was coming after me. The radio went silent for a heartbeat. Sarah, Jack said softly, can you still hear those whistles? She strained her ears, but only the lingering echo of the last whistle lingered in the air. Then it too died away completely. Everything's quiet now, Sarah admitted. I don't know what to do. There was a long pause on the other end. Jack's voice finally broke the silence with a single word, stay safe, Sarah. The line went dead just as she said, Jack. You're listening to the midnight frequency. Keep the lights where they are. The static crackled in my ear, a familiar hum that always crept up at 2 a.m. when the world had settled into its quietest state. Good evening, I said softly into the radio, or should I say, good morning. The line was dead for a moment before the host finally answered. Hello there. This is Midnight Frequency, where we hear your stories of the unexplained. My name's Brian, and it wasn't just a 30-mile drive to Estes Park that had me calling in. It was a story, mine and my family's, that needed to be told. We'd taken our annual hike on what was supposed to be a routine trip into Bear Lake. But nothing about the day went as planned. We started out early, like we always did, so by lunch, it was usually quiet. But something wasn't right that afternoon. The kids were unusually quiet, and my wife Sarah seemed distracted too, her eyes darting around nervously. I tried to chat with them, but their answers were clipped, almost robotic. As we descended into the valley, I turned off the SUV's lights just to see if anyone would notice a difference. When I flicked them back on, everything appeared as it should, except my wife was holding onto the handle of my door so tightly that her knuckles were white. Brian, turn around, she whispered. I did, and there it was, a small clearing by a dense forest of old pines. The sun barely crept through, casting eerie shadows on everything. Sarah motioned for me to pull over, so I did. "Go check the kids in the back," she said firmly. I opened the rear doors, and the youngest, Emily, darted out without a word. Her brother Jack stayed behind, staring up at the trees. The kid never did like hiking much. "Jack, come on now," Sarah began, but he just shook his head and pointed into the woods. I could see nothing from where we stood, so I tried to calm her down. "Let's get back in and keep going." But they weren't moving. Both of them were frozen, staring off into the distance. Sarah's grip on my door tightened even more, and then she whispered, almost inaudibly, "The kids went in, and we came out wrong." I tried to shake her, but her resolve was unbreakable. I turned back to face the woods as she opened the car doors wide, a strange expression on her face, a mix of fear and determination. She stepped into the clearing, following the children who were still standing there, motionless. The radio static began to sound more insistent now, like it was trying to drown out my own voice. I didn't understand what she meant by that phrase. "We came out wrong." What did that even mean? I tried reaching for her, but my hand brushed against nothing as if she had somehow phased through the fabric of reality itself. A chill ran down my spine as I realized no one was coming back from this forest. The last thing I heard before the radio cut off entirely was a whisper, barely audible over the static, "You'll understand soon enough." I slammed the door shut and tried to turn it off, but it didn't respond. The car's lights flickered wildly, like they were battling against some unseen force. I screamed, but no sound came out. In the distance, something howled, a wolf perhaps. Or maybe not. In this quiet, empty landscape, even the trees seemed to whisper secrets in a language I couldn't comprehend. "Help me," the radio murmured back into the dark. The night was as still and black as a whisper, the kind you can't quite hear until someone points it out. I pulled my car over onto the side of the old logging road, the tires crunching on gravel that seemed to hum with some forgotten history. It was 3:24 a.m., well past my usual driving time. The small town of Astoria, Oregon, nestled along the coast, slept like a baby, its lights extinguished except for a few stubborn ones in windows far away. I hadn't planned this trip, it had just happened that my shift ended early, and I felt restless. I needed something to clear my mind, a bit of open road to muffle the day's anxieties. The logging road snaked ahead into darkness, a maze that I could barely make out in the headlights. It was just another empty stretch from the highway, but something about it made me uneasy. I drove slower now, too slow for the conditions, the soft hum of the engine breaking only the heavy silence. Then came the static on my car radio, a low, crackling sound that seemed to seep through the speakers and into my bones. My eyes widened as I recognized the station. It was the midnight frequency. That show had been on my mind since its first broadcast weeks ago. The host's deep voice promised tales of the unexplained, whispers from the past, and perhaps some answers for me. "Anyone there?" I asked aloud, though no one answered. Suddenly, a sharp tap sounded against the driver's side window. At first, I dismissed it as an insect or maybe even a trick of the mind, but then another tap followed. This time, the window fogged up in front of my eyes. My heart pounded so loud that I thought for sure the entire car would hear. "Calm," I told myself. "Just a stray rock." But when I turned to look, the window was clear again. Nothing there but empty space and the endless logging road stretching into the night. I reached out a hand to touch the glass, feeling its chill through my glove. My fingers traced the outline of something, someone standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't just a reflection, it was the shape of a person, tall and dark against the darkness, arms crossed as if waiting. The logging road was empty, yet there they stood, impossibly still. I hit the brakes, but the car didn't stop, as if following some unseen force. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, the fingers stiff with cold. It wasn't until I glanced back that I saw it, the headlights coming from behind, dim and distant, growing ever closer. The figure in front did not move, they waited for me to arrive. Before I knew what was happening, my car collided with something massive, metal screeching against the other object's unyielding surface. My head snapped back as if struck by an invisible blow. When I focused again, the logging road seemed to shift around me, the figure at the center now blurred and indistinct. That's when I saw it. The taillights of my own car had been reversed, leading out of the logging road toward the empty highway. How was this possible? Panic surged through me as I tried to pull over but found the car stuck, immobilized by some unseen force. The tapping resumed, this time louder and more urgent against the driver's side window. A voice whispered, a cold breath in my ear, "You should have stayed on the highway." I couldn't move. My body seemed frozen, trapped in place as if I were an actor in a play, unaware of the director's final commands. And then, with a sudden jolt, the taillights flickered out, leaving me alone and terrified in the middle of that cursed logging road, staring into the abyss of the blackness. In the dead of night, Sarah had always felt safe in her small cabin by the lake. She'd pulled the tent over her head just as the stars turned into pinpricks on the dark horizon. The wind whispered outside, a familiar song that comforted more than it scared. That's how she felt here, tucked away from the world, free and unbothered. That is, until she heard it, an unfamiliar sound that tugged at her nerves like a string of old piano wire. A creaking, almost like something being moved, but not within the tent. Sarah froze, her breath hitching in her throat as the radio's static crackled to life around her, drowning out the sounds of nature for a moment. "Hello?" she whispered into the night, her voice trembling. The line was silent, save for an annoying beep that punctuated the silence like a heartbeat. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the sound that had just been there, slightly muffled, but unmistakably, unzipping. Sarah's heart pounded as she reached out with one hand to check the zipper. Her fingers brushed against the fabric, confirming what she feared. The tent was indeed slightly unzipped, a small gap visible under her headlamp. She gasped when her other hand found something peculiar, feathers or down fluff from inside the sack of sleeping gear she hadn't touched since last night. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as she realized these weren't just any feathers, they seemed to shift and change position, fluttering in a way that defied explanation. Sarah grabbed for her flashlight, trying to find what, or who, could have caused this strange occurrence. She swept the light around the tent floor, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance except for the unzipped zipper and those elusive feathers. She tried to calm down, knowing she was alone in that small space, but panic began to rise like a tide. The static on the radio felt heavier than ever, as though it was mocking her solitude. She called out again into the cold night air, "Is anyone there? I just need someone to talk to." The response was a silence so thick she could almost feel it pressing down upon her. But then, from outside the tent, came that whispering noise again, almost like a gentle breeze playing through reeds, but closer now. Sarah's breath caught in her chest as she clutched her flashlight tightly. She knew what she had to do. It was foolish, unnecessary, and completely rational. With shaking hands, she opened the tent entrance enough for light to spill out into the darkness. The air outside felt colder than before, biting at her skin like tiny needles. The lake shone pale under a silver moon, its surface smooth except for a few dark shadows that seemed to move with her every glance. She stepped out, flashlight sweeping across the area around the tent. Nothing was there. No figure hidden in the darkness, no sound of approaching footsteps, just the steady whispering that seemed to be coming from inside the woods themselves. Sarah took another step, and that's when she saw it, a patch of ground near her feet that had been disturbed, but not by any known force. She knelt down, examining the area carefully. There were no signs of struggle or intrusion, just a small unzipped tent, some misplaced feathers, and an eerie silence that seemed to follow her every movement. Sarah's hand trembled as she grabbed the zipper of the tent, pulling it shut again with renewed force. The static on the radio continued its annoying beep, but for once, it felt comforting in its familiarity. At least now, she was back inside, safe from whatever, or whoever, had tried to enter her space. She zipped up the tent as quickly and firmly as she could, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to be coming closer now, whispering names and stories into the night air. When the zipper clicked into place, there was a moment of peace. But it didn't last long. Sarah felt something brush against her leg, a feather or down, maybe, but not exactly. She shivered, pulling her legs up onto the cot and wrapping herself in a blanket. The static on the radio grew louder, like an old record skipping just before it stops completely. "Is anyone there?" she whispered again into the night, this time without getting any response. She lay down on the sleeping bag, turning off the flashlight as exhaustion began to win over fear. Her breathing slowed until only the sound of the static and the whispering remained. The last thing Sarah heard before sleep claimed her was that whisper, sibilant, chilling, and always just beyond the reach of her hearing. It promised something, whispered names and unexplained events that would never be fully understood. And in the silence that followed, Sarah knew she wouldn't wake up again to find those whispers gone. The tracks that ended. I don't know how many times I've replayed that phrase in my head since that night. It was supposed to be another ordinary night shift at the Marquette High School, but those tracks changed everything. It started as any other late December evening in Marquette, Michigan. The snow had been falling steadily for days, creating an eerie blanket over the small town. I lived on the outskirts of town, my tiny house perched on a hill that overlooked the quiet streets below. At midnight sharp, my phone rang. It was always the same, the hum of static followed by the click of the call connecting. "Hello." My voice cracked, my throat parched from hours of sitting behind the camera in the dark. Hi, this is Steve. I hope I'm not disturbing you," a hesitant whisper came through the line. "I just had to call." Steve's voice was familiar. He worked at Marquette High as a night security guard, his shifts often overlapping with my own in front of the cameras recording the school's after hours. "I'm not bothered by it at all," I replied gently. "Go ahead and tell me what you need." There wasn't much to report usually, just a few stray lights flickering or the sound of creaky floorboards in the empty halls. But something about Steve's voice that night was off. Heavy with worry. "I was walking home through the woods," he began hesitantly. "It's that stretch between the old McPherson house and the quarry. You know how it is, those empty lots in the middle of winter. I've always found them creepy." The old McPherson house sat on the edge of a cliff, its windows dark and eyesores amidst the crisp, white landscape. The quarry was an abandoned pit surrounded by dense brush, a place where few dared to venture after dark. "I was just walking past when it happened," Steve continued. "There were these tracks, fresh ones in the snow, heading towards the old quarry. I followed them for a bit, then they stopped suddenly right in the middle of this open field." Steve's voice grew quieter as he paused, his words trailing off into an unsettling silence. "They just ended," he finished, as if tasting those two words. "I mean, there was no trail leading out again. No signs of anyone or anything that might have passed by." My stomach fluttered with a mix of unease and concern. Steve sounded genuinely shaken. Can you describe what they looked like? I asked, my mind racing to piece together the details. They were big, he mumbled. Like animal prints, but not. The tracks seemed almost too perfect for that. I nodded along despite being miles away, imagining those strange prints on the blanket of snow. I've been back a few times since then, Steve continued slowly. The tracks are still there. They're like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The static humped again, as if protesting his words. A cold wind seemed to whistle through the microphone. Do you think it's something? He asked, barely above a whisper. I hesitated, unsure how much of Steve's fear to acknowledge over the line. Do you want me to come and check this out with you? The phone hummed as if in agreement, but no sound came from Steve. He hung up without another word. Days passed, and I couldn't shake off that conversation. Those tracks kept gnawing at my mind, like an idea that refused to die. The next night, I made a point of heading towards the woods on the same path as Steve had described. It was late enough that only the faint light from distant houses could be seen through the trees. The snow crunched underfoot, and though it was just me now, something felt different. A chill seeped into my bones, making goosebumps rise along my arms. I reached the spot where Steve had said to stop, right in the middle of that vast, open field. The tracks were still there, large, deep impressions in the snow. But as I stood there, staring at those tracks, I felt a creeping sense of dread. It wasn't just their odd shape or size, it was something else. A presence, almost imperceptible but undeniable. Something watched me from the darkness. I turned to leave, my heart hammering, and saw that the snow around the tracks had frozen over, as if time itself had paused for a moment. The tracks were there, untouched and unexplained. And in the silence after I left, a single creak echoed from somewhere deep within the woods, sending a shiver down my spine. It wasn't until hours later, when I was safely back home, that I realized something critical. Those tracks hadn't ended at all, they were just waiting for me to come looking. And now, as I sit here in front of the computer, the only trace of that night is a single sentence echoing in my head, those tracks that didn't end. This next call came in just after 3, the hour they say the veil is thinnest. The cold wind whispered through the trees of the small clearing at dusk. I turned off the flashlight and leaned against my old pickup truck, staring at the flickering flame that refused to stay extinguished. It started during a night shift at the logging camp in Elyth, Minnesota. Most nights, the wood fire died as the last light faded into darkness. But tonight, it didn't. And every time I tried to tamp it down, to finally put it out, it would flare up with an eerie and unexplained vigor. I was alone on this cold, desolate clearing, just the sound of my own breathing, the distant hoot of an owl, and that strange flame that wouldn't be tamed. The night was thick with mist from the nearby lakes, making everything hazy and hard to focus on. The old logging camp surrounded me, each structure a ghostly silhouette against the dimming sky. I tried to light another piece of wood, just something simple to keep it burning, but as soon as I did, that flame roared back with an intensity one hadn't felt before. It was like watching something alive, not a mere fire. The heat from it was more than physical, it seemed almost knowing. I called into the midnight frequency show that night. My story had to be told, but even as I spoke into the microphone, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, or worse, of having awoken something. The host listened calmly, asking for details, trying to understand. But his questions only made me more nervous. I don't know, I stammered. It's not normal. By then, the fire was casting shadows that danced erratically on the trees around us, as if they too were alive. The phone line crackled and popped with static that seemed to grow louder as I talked. When I finally hung up, a chill crept up my spine, and I knew it wasn't just from the cold. Now, every time I pass that clearing, I can hear that flame flickering back into life, waiting, perhaps for someone brave enough or foolish enough to light the match again. And I wonder, is there really something out there that shouldn't be? Or am I simply losing my grip on reality? The fire wouldn't stay lit. The lights drew him in, a curious boy named Jack, 9 years old and just past his bedtime. They were simple lanterns, their soft glow barely cutting through the night, but to Jack they were magical. His father had been out that evening, leaving him with his younger sister to stay safe until morning. The streets of Oxford, Mississippi, were quiet as a grave under the thick blanket of stars, and it was easy enough for the boy to slip away. Jack followed the light, the soft hum of memories pulling at the edges of his mind. His favorite storybook, The Lights in the Forest, lay open on the nightstand beside him. In the tale, a lost child wanders into the woods guided by lanterns, and upon return he is forever changed. Jack wondered if such stories were too far from reality. The woods whispered to him now, their shadows dancing with the rhythmic rise and fall of the lantern lights. He walked deeper, the path worn beneath his feet as if countless children before had trodden here. The air grew colder, a whisper brushing against his neck like fingers too cool to be human. Jack shivered, but he kept moving. The lanterns seemed to grow brighter as he approached, their warmth mingling with the chill of the night. They cast long shadows that twisted and writhed, and in those shapes, Jack saw eyes watching him. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. The light pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, inviting him forward. At last, the lanterns led him to an old hollow tree, its trunk weathered and carved with strange symbols. Inside, he found a narrow passage, just wide enough for him. With hesitant steps, Jack stepped in. The tunnel was dark, but the light from outside still streamed through cracks at the edges, revealing no end to the darkness within. The walls felt cool against his skin, damp with moisture. He walked on, the sound of his own breathing echoing around him. Suddenly, a hand grasped his shoulder, and he jumped back into startled realization it was just his imagination. The light grew stronger, a beam cutting through the shadows like a beacon. Jack followed it deeper until he emerged into a clearing where an old cabin stood abandoned. The lanterns had led him to this place, but what lay inside was something else entirely. Inside the cabin, the air was cold and still, filled with an eerie silence that clung to his ears. Shadows moved in the corner, not of people but of things, shadows that shifted and curved as if alive. The floorboards creaked underfoot, protesting silently against intruders. Jack called out softly into the darkness, hoping for a response, any indication of humanity. But there was none. A faint whisper seemed to float on the air, too quiet to make sense but filled with an otherworldly presence. It sent shivers down his spine and made him feel older than he ever had in his life. As quickly as it came, the lantern light flickered out, plunging him into complete darkness. The silence that followed was absolute. Jack stood rooted where he was, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribcage. He turned to leave but found his way blocked by an invisible barrier. Panic began to rise in his throat. And then he heard it, whispers again, louder this time, a soft murmur of voices that seemed to move from place to place. They spoke of ancient things and forgotten lore, words that twisted and changed as if alive. Each whispered phrase left Jack feeling more lost than before. The whispers grew into something inhuman, the air itself seeming to vibrate with the weight of their secrets. Jack's breath caught in his chest, his body shaking uncontrollably. He knew he needed to leave but found himself unable to move. The cold seemed to seep deeper, filling him entirely until he was no longer just a boy. And then, without warning, the lanterns returned, leading him back out into the night. The world outside looked different now, as if altered by what he had seen within. Jack stumbled toward home, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets, each step heavier than the last. He didn't notice that when he finally reached the safety of his own bed, he was older than before, wiser but wearier. He woke in the morning to find his sister beside him, looking at him with a mix of concern and confusion. Jack's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there seemed to be an unspoken understanding between them, an awareness that something had changed. Something beyond simple nightmares or childish fears. Jack lay there, staring up at the ceiling, the lanterns in his storybook still open, their pages now damp with the moisture of his own silent tears. The night had claimed him, but he didn't know if it was for keeps. In the stillness of a Wyoming night, under a sky so starry it seemed you could pluck its constellations with your fingers, John Miller sat alone on the concrete stoop of his dilapidated hunting shack. He had left his phone inside, tucked away in an unlit corner of the cabin, and now he found himself wishing for something, anything, to distract him from the endless silence. John's flashlight cut through the darkness like a pale beam of a distant star. The forest around him seemed to whisper secrets in the dark, as if it was aware of his solitude. He had just finished recounting that day's hunt, a futile one, as always, and was now listening for any sound that might hint at success. The trees were eerily quiet, only the distant whine of a highway far too close, sounding out of place against the vast expanse of the night sky. His old Chevy truck sat parked on the dirt road just outside, its engine still warm from the day's drive to this remote corner where he was the only hunter. A soft rustling caught his attention and his flashlight beam flickered towards a nearby bush. He paused, holding his breath as the brush swayed gently in the wind. Then, something strange happened. A voice echoed back to him, his own voice, repeating exactly what he had just said about needing one more successful hunt before heading home. John blinked hard, staring into the darkness where no one could have possibly been standing. He tried it again, calling out the words, "I need one more to make this worth the drive." And without fail, his voice responded from the shadows, mimicking him in a tone that was eerily precise and chillingly close. John's heart pounded like an old drum at nightfall. He stumbled over the rough ground towards the truck but kept his flashlight trained on the brush. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, trying to snap a picture or record what had just happened, but it felt too heavy in his pocket. Back inside the cabin, John set about making himself busy, pouring water from the jug into a plastic cup, pacing back and forth, lighting more candles until the room was half lit. Yet still, that voice echoed through his mind, repeating his words as if mocking him. His pulse raced as he dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice cut through John's panic. "What can I do for you, sir?" "Just listen," he managed to say in a strangled whisper. "I heard my own voice from the brush." There was a moment of silence on the line before the dispatcher replied, "Can you please describe what happened again?" But as soon as John began recounting his bizarre experience, the phone clicked off. He stood there, alone once more, his hands shaking. The hunter who had always been self-reliant now found himself utterly dependent. John sat back in a worn chair and tried to call his wife back home but only heard ringing. His phone seemed dead, as if it was no longer connected to the world beyond this isolated spot on the Wyoming plains. A chill ran down his spine, something in those woods did not want him there tonight. And with each breath, he could almost hear that voice echoing through the night. He turned off all the lights and closed his eyes, trying to focus on anything but what had just happened. But when he opened them again, he saw a figure standing in the doorway of the cabin, just as still as the darkness outside. And it was mimicking his every movement. 3 a.m., and the air outside is heavy with the scent of wet earth. The old switchboard crackles softly as it picks up the call from the quiet Georgia night. "This is Midnight Frequency," says the host, his voice calm yet filled with an undercurrent of understanding. "I'm Tom, your host for tonight. Someone out there has something to share." A moment of silence stretches out, until a muffled voice comes through. "Hi. Tom." "Yes, you're on air now," Tom replies, his tone soft and inviting. "What's your story?" "I was just walking my dog," the caller says hesitantly, as if he might change his mind at any moment. "It was a clear night in Savannah, full moon, bright enough to light up our old neighborhood." "Sounds peaceful," Tom observes. "It is, usually. But last week, I took my dog for an evening walk in that grove of trees down by the old cemetery on River Road. It's been empty and quiet for years now." The caller hesitates again. "There are always surprises, aren't there?" Tom suggests gently. "I found this grave marker," the caller continues. "Not one I recognized. Just a single unmarked stone in the middle of nowhere, no headstone nearby to put it in context. It was old, weathered like the rest, but it felt different somehow. A strange feeling about something that's supposed to be ordinary." Tom asks carefully. "Yeah," the caller confirms. "But there's more." A pause. "Last night, I got a strange call from home. My wife told me to check for my car keys, said she saw them in the living room. She hadn't been out all day." "And you went to look?" Tom prompts. "I walked down to the living room and found nothing. Just empty space where my keys should have been. I called her back, she said she was sure she had seen them." The caller's voice trembles slightly over these words. "Did you check again later?" "No, not really. But when I got outside, the old cemetery grove, something didn't seem right." "What did you notice?" Tom asks, sensing that whatever follows will stick with us long after this segment ends. "I saw the same unmarked stone." The caller's voice is now almost a whisper. "But it wasn't in the middle of nowhere anymore, it was by a big oak tree near my house, close to where we used to park our car." "You're sure about that?" Tom queries, his tone now filled with quiet intensity. "I didn't want to believe it," the caller admits. "So I went back out after a few minutes, looking for the stone again. It was gone." Another pause. "But something else stayed, just below the surface of where it should have been." The caller's voice trails off, leaving an almost tangible chill in its wake. Tom's calm voice fills the air once more. "Tell me, do you think it might move again?" "Maybe," comes the reply, uncertain and filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. "That's what I'm afraid to check." The line goes silent for a moment, and Tom speaks softly over the sound of static. "I'll leave you here, in that dark grove, just waiting. Knowing there might be a stone where no one has ever expected to find it." The phone crackles as if caught by some gusty wind, then goes dead. And in the quiet that follows, I can hear Tom's voice echoing faintly, "Until next time, stay safe and listen closely." If you're still with us, good. A lot of people stopped listening alone after this one. It's 2 a.m. when Sarah calls into the midnight frequency, her voice steady but tinged with an uncharacteristic shiver. She speaks from Bardstown, Kentucky, a small town where the air is crisp and heavy with history. "Hello. Is someone there?" she asks, her words trailing off as if she's just barely holding on to the phone. This isn't a prank call. Her voice is soft but carries enough weight to be heard clearly through the static-filled line. The host pauses, allowing Sarah's words to resonate. "Go ahead, Sarah," he says gently. "Tell me your story." "Okay." She takes a deep breath. "It was just another night for me at work, a quiet shift at the cabin in the woods north of Bardstown. I'd been there before, but not since college days when we would stay up all night, telling ghost stories and sipping old-timers. But lately, it had been idle, closed down and locked tight. She hesitates, then continues. The job was routine, keep it clean, check on the water supply, simple things. But something felt different this time. Maybe I was just tired from staying up late with my kids. Or maybe there were other reasons. Sarah pauses again, her voice catching slightly. I was in charge of this place for a few days while the caretaker was off sick. There's an old logbook next to the fireplace that nobody uses anymore. It's just a notebook where they've written about past guests or maintenance issues over the years. The host nods, encouraging her with gentle silence. I opened it and started flipping through the pages, she continues softly. Each entry was marked by its date, some faded and illegible, others neat and precise. I was just checking to see if anything needed addressing when I noticed something odd. She draws a breath, feeling the weight of her words now. The last few entries were written in neat blue ink, dated a year apart. The first one said, "Cabin felt too quiet this weekend, must be haunted." Just a simple sentence. But then there was another entry 3 months later, same cabin guest book, same message, no noise and strange feeling of emptiness. Maybe we're not alone after all. Sarah's voice trails off as she swallows hard. Then I turned the page and found it, the final entry, just a few days ago, nobody will visit again, it's too cold here. The host nods once more, his tone solemn yet supportive. What happened next, Sarah? I closed the book, my hands shaking, she says quietly. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Then I heard something, a faint creaking of the floorboards coming from above me. I froze, listening. She takes a breath, her voice steadier now. It was like a warning, as if whoever or whatever was there didn't want anyone else to know about the cabin anymore. Did you go up and investigate? Sarah hesitates, her mind racing. I just stood there for a moment, then turned off the lights, leaving only the emergency lamp on. The darkness seemed to press in around me. I walked out of the cabin without another thought. Now what happened next? I got home at dawn, she says softly. The cabin had been locked from the inside that whole time. It was like it never even existed. Sarah pauses, her voice breaking slightly as if she's reliving it in the moment. But something feels wrong now. Like someone, or something, didn't want me to tell my story. The host allows a few moments of silence before speaking again. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing this with us. And good night, she adds quietly. As the connection drops, the sound of static returns to the airwaves, leaving behind only the echo of Sarah's words and the unsettling feeling that something lingered in the dark, unspoken cabin. It was late, past midnight in the small town of Weston, West Virginia. I sat alone at my desk, phone cradled against my ear as static crackled through it. The dispatcher's voice was soft and muffled, but not entirely unrecognizable. We've had some activity down that way, he said, his tone heavy with unease. The rangers say they haven't reported anything in 3 nights now. My breath hitched, a small chill tracing the back of my neck as I considered what it meant. Weston was no stranger to the peculiarities and ghost stories that whispered through the night. But the ranger patrol? That was different. We're supposed to be monitoring those woods, I continued into the phone. They're patrolling regularly. My voice echoed faintly in the quiet of the station, a stark contrast to the empty highway outside my window. The call had been made at 3:17 a.m., the hour when time seemed to stretch. The rangers had been a steady presence for years, 3 men who kept watch over an area known as Deadwood Hollow. They were supposed to report back every 4 hours with updates on their patrol, check-ins that never failed until now. The silence from their phone was unnerving. The ranger station was a small wooden shack perched on the edge of the forest, visible only by its light, flickering like an eerie beacon in the darkness. I could imagine it now, cold and isolated, with the whispers of the woods barely heard over the howling wind. I checked my watch, 3:20 a.m. Time was crawling, and the tension thickened around me. "We need to get someone out there," I said, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The ranger patrol had stopped 3 nights ago, 3 nights where there should have been reports of normalcy. There were no quick answers from the dispatcher. Instead, he asked softly, "Have you ever seen what's down there?" The question sent a shiver through me. Deadwood Hollow was rumored to be cursed, a place where night shifts never fully ended and voices carried in the dead of night. The Rangers had faced their share of stories but had always returned with only the facts. "I've heard the rumors," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But we can't just ignore it." The dispatcher's reply was brief. "They're going to send someone out first thing in the morning." But as he hung up, leaving me alone once more, I knew there would be no immediate resolution. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The deadness of Deadwood Hollow hung heavy in the air outside, a quiet and ominous presence. As I listened to the night, a sense of dread settled over me. What if tonight was different? The next morning, a lone patrol would venture into those woods, but they might not return with any answers. And that thought lingered like a shadow, darkening my thoughts as I turned off the radio and went back to sleep, knowing something wasn't right, and that the forest still held its secrets tightly. The night was still in Bozeman, Montana, when Jack hung up his phone after a long shift. His bloodied hands trembled as he typed out what felt like an impossible story on his battered laptop, his daughter's account of a frightening experience that had happened just down the road. "Mommy," she had said in her small voice, "can we please listen to a scary story? Just one." Her mother, Marley, had chuckled and agreed. Little did either of them know what they were about to hear. It was a crisp September evening when Marley decided to take her 8-year-old daughter on an impromptu drive through the nearby forest. They parked their old sedan at the edge of the woods and set out, flashlight in hand, ready for some adventure. The air smelled of earth and fallen leaves, and the trees stood tall and silent around them. They walked deeper into the woods until Jackie stopped suddenly, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mommy," she whispered, pointing to a clearing that seemed unnaturally empty, "I hear something." Marley frowned, listening intently. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant howl of an owl. Jackie persisted. "It's coming from over there." She started running towards it with her flashlight in front of her. Marley jogged after her, calling out softly to keep up. But then, all the forest life stopped abruptly, the crickets ceased their song, the owls went silent, and even the rustling leaves stilled as if someone had pressed a pause button. Marley's heart raced. She quickened her pace, reaching out for Jackie's hand, but it was empty in hers. "Jackie," she called, voice breaking slightly. The forest remained absolutely still, save for an eerie hush. As Marley turned to make sure Jackie hadn't stepped out of sight, a low growl echoed around them, a sound so unsettling that her breath hitched. She spun around, searching the darkness, but saw nothing. Then, without warning, the growl became something else entirely, like hundreds of tiny feet stamping against the forest floor in perfect unison. Marley stumbled backward as a wave of cold air hit her, followed by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from every direction at once. "We know what you're here for," it said. Marley felt icy tears begin to sting her eyes and she clung to her flashlight, shaking uncontrollably. Suddenly, the forest was filled with the sound of animals returning, birds chirping, squirrels rustling, insects buzzing back into life. But as swiftly as they had stopped, the noises ceased once more, leaving only the growl echoing, thick in the night air. "Mommy," Jackie's voice sounded from behind them, small and scared, "can we go home now?" Marley turned to find her daughter standing just a few feet away, flashlight held up high. "Sure, sweetie," she replied, trying to steady her voice, but instead, more tears spilled down her cheeks as they retraced their steps through the eerily silent woods. Once back in the car, Marley started it up immediately and pulled away from the clearing without looking back. The engine hummed beneath her hands, warm compared to the night. She drove as quickly as she dared, praying that what they had heard was just a bad dream. But even as the clearing slipped further into her rearview mirror, the sound of that low growl lingered in her mind. And now, sitting in his darkened room under a blanket of stars, Jack held Marley's story close. The forest seemed eerily quiet tonight, save for the distant cry of an owl and the cold wind whispering secrets through the pines. The phone rang through the stillness of my apartment like a ghost whispering in my ear. I hesitated, half expecting it to go silent, but then came the voice, a calm, deep tone that seemed to echo from beyond the veil of reality. "Good evening," said the host, his voice steady and unflappable. "This is Midnight Frequency. I'm Alex. If you have a story, something that's left you questioning." I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling slightly on the receiver. "Hi, yeah. This might sound strange, but it's not like I've called before or anything. It just started happening about 10 years ago." Alex waited patiently. "Back when I was younger," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "I'd go camping every summer in this old cabin near Mount Bachelor. There were always people around then, but something changed. Something got lonely. The radio hissed and crackled, almost as if it shared the unease of the air that night. I was only 12 when I started noticing it. I would pitch my tent and start cooking dinner, and all of a sudden, it'd be so quiet, you could hear a needle drop. My eyes drifted to an old photograph on my bookshelf, a smiling boy standing next to his father near the same cabin. But then, I continued, there'd be that noise." Alex paused before speaking again, giving me time to recall. "A soft creaking sound. It would get louder and more insistent. You'd think it was just a branch in the wind or something, but no, every single night it would start right after my dad's old Volkswagen Jetta drove up to the cabin." Silence followed for a moment on both sides of the line. "I thought maybe it was him, checking on me or something," I said. "But then he'd leave again and there he wouldn't be. Just the noise. And it would sound like footsteps. Quiet and steady. Always in my direction." A low whine entered the background on the radio. I could imagine the static of a night that was slowly turning cold. Then last year, it got worse. I remember sitting up one night, staring at the wall, trying to figure out where those steps were coming from. There were no windows in my tent, but there had been an old ladder that my dad used to climb into his attic above the cabin. But this. My breath hitched as I tried not to imagine what lay beyond. And then, like a trick of the mind, it stopped. The footsteps. The creaking, everything. It just left me in this eerie silence, like there was something watching. Alex didn't prompt, he simply listened intently. But that wasn't all. When I woke up early one morning, the static on the radio cut off for a moment, as if the night itself needed a moment to catch its breath. I heard it again. My voice broke. In my sleep, I thought I felt something brush against me. Just once, but it was enough. Alex's voice filled the void, his words soft and sincere. "And what did you do that morning?" I shivered, clutching the edge of the table, feeling every fiber of my being tense. I ran, I whispered hoarsely. I just got up, threw some clothes on, and bolted for the car. It was already starting to get light out, but there it was, footprints in the dirt, disappearing towards the old bridge that leads down from the cabin. The radio static returned, like a constant reminder of the unknown. And then I came here, I finished, my voice a mere thread. Because something doesn't feel right about that cabin anymore. It's quiet and empty, but there's always a sense that someone is waiting for me in the night. Don't touch that dial. Stay with me, the next one is worse. 3 a.m., and the only sound in Mike's small bedroom was the distant hum of his old trail camera alarm. He had set it up weeks ago near an abandoned barn on his father's farm, hoping to catch some elusive deer or maybe a rare fox. The device hadn't budged until today, when it blinked to life at precisely 2:37 a.m. Mike stretched, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he walked over to the camera. He opened the compartment carefully and pulled out the memory card, cradling it as if handling something fragile. As he plugged it into his computer, the first photo came up on screen, of nothing. Just blackness, save for one indistinct shape that was barely there. But the second image, captured mere seconds later, held Mike's breath. There, standing in front of the barn, perfectly still and just inside the frame, stood a figure, a woman, dressed all in white, her face obscured by a sheer veil. The light from the camera seemed to freeze this apparition mid-step. Mike's heart hammered in his chest as he backed away from the screen. He leaned back on the chair, staring at the image for what felt like an eternity. The last time he had visited the barn, he swore there was nothing but darkness and broken glass inside. His father had called it haunted, but Mike had always laughed off such superstitions. He stared out his window at the still night, wondering who this woman in white could be. Was she a spirit seeking peace or a warning to stay clear? Mike's mind raced as he recalled every story of old, tales passed down by his grandmother about the woman in white who haunts the area, her cries said to lure lost travelers into the abandoned barn. But why now? Why this photo? Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this a secret. The camera kept going, snapping away at odd moments when it should have been dormant. More photos of the woman in white appeared, same outfit, same veil, different angles. What if she had seen him? What would he do if she came for him? A chill slithered down his spine as Mike realized there was one more thing to check. He hit print and left the computer to search the barn once more. The flashlight in hand, he stepped inside, moving cautiously through the rubble of broken wood and glass. But where before had only darkness greeted him now, his breath caught. There stood a single figure in white, just as in the photo, motionless, staring out into the night. Mike's fingers shook as he grabbed his phone to call the radio station. They needed to know about this. This was no longer his problem alone. But as he dialed, the woman turned. Her veil parted, and her eyes met his. And she stepped forward. The camera flashed again. In the dead of a winter's night, just before 3 a.m., I found myself standing in front of the old Willowbrook Motel. The neon sign flickered dully above me, casting an eerie green glow on the snow-covered ground. I was the last person out of the woods after my last night shift at the nearby forest research station. My car's engine purred softly as if aware that it had been a long day. The trees loomed like ancient guardians, their twisted branches clawing at the fading light. Something about this place felt off, but I pushed the unease aside. It was just old Willowbrook, nothing more than an empty shell with its own peculiar history, but mostly known for its, well, you get the picture. I reached into my coat pocket to check the time, a cold reminder that it wasn't yet 3 a.m., by a few minutes. I pressed the button on my radio and the static crackled in response. Midnight frequency, a smooth voice intoned, "We have one caller from Willowbrook. You've reached the late-night paranormal channel." The static cleared enough to hear his words over the chatter of the studio crew. "I think something strange happened. It's not exactly what I would call a hauntings or a full-on supernatural event, but it was unsettling," he said in a low voice. I felt my blood turn cold as I listened intently. "Do tell us more." "Yeah, okay. You know that old house at the edge of the forest?" His voice became strained. "The one they say no one goes into because, well, you get it. It's been empty for decades and rumor has it the whole place is cursed or something like that." "And did someone visit this haunted place tonight?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was late," he said with a shiver. "I think it was after 2 o'clock. I wanted to get in before too many people saw me there and start asking questions. So I went into the woods to find the house. It's always easier at night when no one is around." "Can you describe what happened inside?" Silence. The static began to interfere, almost as if the radio was refusing to transmit further. "No," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't exactly normal. I mean, it shouldn't have even opened, but there was a door. And when I stepped in." "Tell us about what you saw," I urged. "Well, the house looked exactly like I've seen photos of it online, desolate and abandoned. But then, as soon as I pushed through that doorway, everything went quiet, a really eerie kind of quiet. The air felt cold, but not just because it was winter. It's almost as if there was no one else in the world." "What happened next?" I prodded. "I heard a sound, I don't know what. It wasn't like anything I've ever heard before, but it made me realize that something was following me. Like footsteps, echoing in the shadows. But when I turned around to look, there was nothing." The line grew even noisier now, as if something on the other end of his phone was trying to disrupt our conversation. "Can you explain what happened after that?" I asked with increasing urgency. "It's hard to describe," he muttered. "I felt like time wasn't moving right. Everything seemed to stretch out, slow down. It took me forever to even step into the house. And then when I was inside, I realized." "Realize what?" I urged. "I don't know if this is real or just my imagination running wild," he said hesitantly. "But there's a chill coming from that same door. Like something cold, almost tangible, is trapped in the room with me." "What do you mean it's still there?" It was as if the door pushed itself open and I walked through, but when I turned around to leave, it just closed behind me. "There is no way out now," he admitted. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "How long have you been inside? What do you see?" Silence hung heavily in the air for what felt like an eternity before his voice returned, barely audible. "It's not dark anymore. The room is flooded with light." And then the line went dead. And that's where we'll close the lines for tonight. If you made it this far, if you're still here in the dark with me, then you're one of us now. The ones who listen after midnight. The ones who don't quite turn the radio all the way off. Before you go, do one thing. Subscribe, and turn on the bell. Every week we bring another lost night back from the static, and you don't want to miss the frequency when it opens again. Until then, keep a light on. Check the locks. And if your phone rings after 3, and there's only static on the other end, you don't have to answer. This has been the Midnight Frequency. Good night. And sleep with the radio on.